We continue and probably conclude Nicias from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Nicias, glancing darkly at these matters, and unwilling to speak out plainly, made his colleagues imagine that it was cowardice which made him talk in this manner, and saying that this was the old story over again, the well-known procrastinations and delays and refinements with which, at first, he let slip the opportunity in not immediately falling on the enemy, but suffering the armament to become a thing of yesterday that nobody was alarmed with, they took the side of Demosthenes, and with ado forced Nicias to comply, and so Demosthenes, taking the land forces by night, made an assault upon Epipola. Part of the enemy he slew ere they took the alarm, the rest defending themselves he put to flight. Nor was he content with this victory there, but pushed on further till he met the Boeotians, for these were the first that made head against the Athenians, and charged them with a shout, spear against spear, and killed many on the place. And now, at once, there ensued a panic and confusion throughout the whole army. The victorious portion got infected with the fears of the flying part, and those who were still disembarking and coming forward, falling foul of the retreaters, came into conflict with their own party, taking the fugitives for pursuers, and treating their friends as if they were the enemy. Thus huddled together in disorder, distracted with fear and uncertainties, and unable to be sure of seeing anything, the night not being absolutely dark, nor yielding any steady light, the moon then towards setting shadowed with the many weapons and bodies that moved to and fro, and glimmering so as not to show an object plain, but to make friends enough for through fear suspected for foes, and Athenians fell into utter perplexity and desperation, for moreover they had the moon at their backs, and consequently their own shadows fell upon them, and both hid the number and the glittering of their arms, while the reflection of the moon from the shields of the enemy made them show more numerous and had been appointed than indeed they were at last, being pressed on every side. When once they had given way, they took to rout, and in their flight were destroyed, some by the enemy, some by the hand of their friends, and some tumbling down the rocks, while those that were dispersed and straggled about were picked off in the morning by the horsemen, and put to the sword. The slain were 2,000, and the rest, few, came off safe with their arms. Upon this disaster, which to him was not wholly an expected one, Nicias accused the rashness of Demosthenes, but he, making his excuses for the past, now advised to be gone in all haste, for neither were other forces to come, nor could the enemy be beaten with the present, and indeed, even supposing they were yet too hard for the enemy in any case, they ought to remove and quit a situation which they understood to be always accounted a sickly one, and dangerous for an army, and was more particularly unwholesome now, as they could see themselves, because of the time of year. It was the beginning of autumn, and many now lay sick, and all were out of heart. It grieved Nicias to hear of flight and departing home, not that he did not fear the Syracusans, but he was worse afraid of the Athenians, their impeachments and sentences. He professed that he apprehended no further harm there, or if it must be, he would rather die by the hand of an enemy than by his fellow citizens. He was not of the opinion which Leo of Byzantium declared to his fellow citizens, "I'd rather," said he, "perish by you than with you," as to matter of place and quarter, whether to remove their camp, that he said might be debated at leisure, and Demosthenes, his former counsel, having succeeded so ill, ceased to press him further. Others thought Nicias had reasons for expectation, and relied on some assurance from the people within the city, and that this made him so strongly oppose the retreat, so they acquiesced. But fresh forces were now coming to the Saracens, and the sickness growing worse in his camp. He also now approved of their retreat, and commanded the soldiers to make ready to go abroad, to go aboard. And when all were in readiness, and none of the enemy had observed them, not expecting such a thing, the moon was eclipsed in the night, to the great fright of Nicias and others, who, for want of experience or out of superstition, felt alarm at such appearances. And yeah, if you don't know what's going on, but also there's that aspect of it's a good time to do ritual. Eclipse prayers. I do eclipse prayers. That the sun might be darkened about the close of the month, is even extraordinary people now understood pretty well to be the effect of the moon, but the moon itself to be darkened, and how that could come about, and how on the sudden a broad full moon should lose her light and show such various colors, was not easy to be comprehended. They concluded it to be ominous, and a divine intimation of some heavy calamities, for he who, the first and the most plainly of any, and with the greatest assurance, committed to writing how the moon is enlightened and overshadowed, was Anaxagoras, and he was as yet but recent, nor was his argument much known, but was rather kept secret, passing only amongst a few under some kind of caution and confidence. People would not then tolerate natural philosophers and theorists, as they called them, about things above, as lessening the divine power by explaining away its agency into the operation of irrational causes and senseless forces acting by necessity, without anything of providence or a free agent. Hence it was that Protagoras was banished, and Anaxagoras cast in prison, so that Pericles had much difficulty to produce his liberty. And Socrates, though he had no concern whatever with this sort of learning, yet was put to death for philosophy. It was only afterwards that the reputation of Plata, I know people say Socrates and Plato, and I don't know the Greek, so reputation of Plato shining forth by his life, and became his subjected natural necessity to divine and more excellent principles, took away the oblique and scandal that had attached to such contemplations, and obtained these studies currency among all people. So his friend Dion, when the moon, at the time he was to embark from Zacynthus, went against Dionysius, was eclipsed, was not in the least disturbed, but went on, at arriving at Syracuse, expelled the tyrant. But it so fell out with Nicias that he had not at this time a skillful diviner with him. His former habitual adviser, he used to moderate much of his superstition, Stylipides, had died a little before. For in fact this progeny, as Philochorus observes, was not unlucky for men wishing to fly, but on the contrary very favorable. For things done in fear require to be hidden, and the light is their foe. Nor was it used to observe signs in the sun or moon more than 3 days, as Euclides states in his commentaries, but Nicias persuaded them to wait another full course of the moon, as if he had not seen it clear again as soon as ever it passed the region of the shadow where the light was obstructed by the earth. In a manner, abandoning all other cares, he betook himself wholly to his sacrifices, till the enemy came upon them with their infantry, besieging the forts and camps, placing their ships in a circle about the harbor. Nor did the men in the galleys only, but the little boys everywhere got into the fishing boats and rowed up and challenged the Athenians and insulted over them. Amongst these a youth of noble parentage, Heraclides by name, having ventured out beyond the rest, an Athenian ship pursued and well nigh took him. His uncle Palicus, in fear for him, put out with 10 galleys, which he commanded, and the rest to relieve Palicus. In like manner he drew forth, the result of it being a very sharp engagement, in which the Syracusans had the victory, and slew Eurymedon with many others. After this, the Athenian soldiers had no patience to stay longer, but raised an outcry against their officers, requiring them to depart by land, for the Syracusans, upon their victory, immediately shut and blocked up the entrance of the harbor. But Nicias would not consent to this, as it was a shameful thing to leave behind so many ships of burden and galleys little less than 200. Putting therefore on board the best of the foot and the most serviceable darters, they filled 110 galleys. The rest wanted oars. The remainder of his army, Nicias, posted along the seaside, abandoning the great camp and the fortifications adjoining the temple of Hercules. So the Syracusans, not having for a long time performed their usual sacrifice to Hercules, went up now, both priests and captains, to sacrifice, and their galleys being manned, the diviners predicted from their sacrifices victory and glory to the Syracusans, provided they would not be the aggressors, but fight upon the defensive. For so Hercules overcame all by only defending himself when set upon. In this confidence they set out, and this proved the hottest and fiercest of all their sea fights, raising no less concern and passion in the beholders than in the actors, as they could oversee the whole action with all the various and unexpected turns of fortune which in a short space occurred in it, the Athenians suffering no less from their own preparations than from the enemy, for they fought against light and nimble ships that could attack from any quarter with theirs laden and heavy, and they were thrown at with stones that fly indifferently any way, for which they could only return darts and arrows, the direct aim of which motion the water disturbed, preventing their coming true point foremost to their mark. The Syracusans had learned from Ariston, the Corinthian pilot, who, fighting stoutly, fell himself in this very engagement, when the victory had already declared for the Syracusans, the Athenians, their loss and slaughter being very great, their flight by sea cut off, their safety by land so difficulty, did not attempt to hinder the enemy towing away their ships under their eyes, nor demanding their dead, as indeed their want of burial seemed a less calamity than the leaving behind the sick and wounded which they now had before them. Yet more miserable still did they reckon themselves who were to work on yet, though more such sufferings, after all to reach the same end. They prepared to dislodge that night, and Gylippus and his friends, seeing the Syracusans engage in their sacrifices and in their cups for their victories, and it being also holiday, did not expect either by persuasion or by force to rouse them up and carry them against the Athenians as they decamped, but Hermocrates of his own head put a trick upon Nicias, and sent some of his companions to him, who pretended they came from those that were wont to hold secret intelligence with him, and advised him not to stir that night, The Saracens having laid ambushes and beset the ways, Nicias, caught with this stratagem, remained to encounter presently, in reality, what he had feared when there was no occasion, for they, the next morning, marching before, seized the defiles, fortified the passes, where the rivers were fordable, and cut down the bridges, and ordered their horsemen to range the plains and grounds that lay open, so as to leave no part of the country where the Athenians could move without fighting. They stayed both that day and another night, and went along as if they were leaving their own, not an enemy's country, lamenting and bewailing for want of necessaries, and for their parting from friends and companions that were not able to help themselves, and nevertheless judging the present evils lighter than those they expected to come. But among many miserable spectacles, they appeared up and down in the camp. The saddest sight of all was Nicias himself, laboring under his malady, and unworthily reduced to the scantiest supply of all the accommodations necessary for human wants, of which he in his condition required more than ordinary, because of his sickness, yet hearing up under all this illness, and doing and undergoing than many in perfect health. And it was plainly evident, but all this toil was not for himself, or from any regard to his own life, but that purely for the sake of those under his command. He would not abandon hope, and indeed the rest were given over to weeping and lamentation through fear or sorrow. But he, whenever he yielded to anything of the kind, did so, it was evident, from reflection upon the shame and dishonor of the enterprise, contrasted with the greatness and glory of the success he had anticipated, and not only the sight of his person, but also of the recollection of the arguments and the dissuasions he used to prevent the expedition, enhanced their sense of the undeservedness of his sufferings. Nor had they any heart to put their trust in these things that people consider to be gods and goddesses, considering that a man so religious, who had performed to the divine powers so many and so great acts of devotion, should have no more favorable treatment than the wickedest and meanest of the army. And, well, religion is how you relate to the community too. It's not just, doing a bunch of rituals. And how you relate to the community and the rest of creation, that has obviously affects how the creation reacts back upon you. But it's not all gospel of prosperity or gospel of suffering or whatever either. Nicias, however, endeavored all the while, by his voice, his countenance, and carriage, to show himself undefeated by these misfortunes. And all along the way, shot at and receiving wounds 8 days continually from the enemy, he yet preserved the forces with him in a body entire, till that Demosthenes was taken prisoner with the party that he led, whilst they fought and made a resistance, and so got behind and were surrounded near the country house of Polydeuces. Demosthenes thereupon drew his sword and wounded, but did not kill himself, the enemy speedily running in and seizing upon him. So soon as the Saracens had gone and informed Nicias of this, and he had sent some horsemen, and by them knew the certainty of the defeat of that division, he then vouchsafed to see the Gylippus for a truce, to sue the Gylippus for a truce, for the Athenians to depart out of Sicula, leaving hostages for a payment of money the Saracens had expended in the war. Now, in Latin, he pronounced the C as a K. Well, the older Latin stuff. More recently, people say it like Italian. I'm not sure at what part that was the case, but I'm trying to give things sort of a Greek pronunciation for obvious reasons here. But now they would not hear of these proposals, but threatening and reviling them angrily and insultingly, continued to ply their missiles at them. Now destitute of every necessary, yet Nicias still made good his retreat all that night, and the next day, through all their darts, made his way to the river Acinarus. There, however, the enemy, encountering them, drove some into the stream, while others, ready to die for thirst, plunged in headlong, while they drank at the same time and were cut down by their enemies. And here the cruelest and most immoderate slaughter, till at last Nicias, falling down to Gylippus, "Let pity, O Gylippus," said he, "move you in your victory, not for me, who was destined, it seems, to bring the glory I once had to this end, but for the other Athenians, as you well know that the chances of war are common to all, and the Athenians use them moderately and mildly towards you in their prosperity." At these words, and at the sight of Nicias, Gylippus was somewhat troubled, for he was sensible that the Lacedaemonians had received good offices from Nicias in the late treaty, and he thought it would be a great and glorious thing for him to carry off the chief commanders of the Athenians alive. He therefore raised Nicias with respect, and bade him to be of good cheer, and commanded his men to spare the lives of the rest. But the word of command being communicated slowly, and slain was a far greater number than the prisoners. Many, however, were privately conveyed away by particular soldiers. Those taken openly were hurried together in a mass, their arms and spoils hung up on the finest and largest trees along the river, their conquerors with garlands on their heads, with their own horses splendidly adorned, and cropping short the names and tails of those of their enemies, entered the city, having in the most signal conflict ever waged by Greeks against Greeks, and with the greatest strength and utmost effort of valor and manhood, won a most entire victory, and a general assembly of the people of Syracuse and their confederates, sitting Eurycles, the popular leader, moved first, that the day on which they took Nicias should from thenceforward be kept holiday by sacrificing and forbearing all manner of work. And from the river he called the Acinarian feast. This was the 26th day of the month Carneus, the Athenian Metagitnion, and that the servants of the Athenians with other confederates be sold for slaves, and they themselves and the Sicilian auxiliaries be kept and employed in the quarries, except the generals, who should be put to death. Now, we really should say the month, how it relates to our month more. The Syracusans favored the proposals. The translators should throw in a notice of this. When Hermocrates said that to use well a victory was better than to gain a victory, he was met with great clamor and outcry, when Gylippus also demanded the Athenian generals to be delivered to him, that he might carry them to the Lacedaemonians. The Syracusans, now insolent with their good fortune, gave him ill words. Indeed, before this, even in the war, they had been impatient at his rough behavior and Lacedaemonian haughtiness, and had, as Timaeus tells us, discovered sordidness and avarice in his character, vices which may have descended to him from his father Dryden, who was convicted of bribery and banished. And the very man himself, of the 1,000 talents which Lysander sent to Sparta, embezzled 30 and hid them under the tiles of his house, and was detected and shamefully fled his country. But this he related more at large in the life of Lysander. Timaeus says that Demosthenes and Nicias did not die, as Thucydides and Philistus have written, by the order of the Syracusans, but that upon a message sent them from Hermocrates, while yet the assembly were sitting, by the connivance of some of their guards, they were enabled to put an end to themselves. Their bodies, however, were thrown out before the gates and offered for a public spectacle. And I have heard that to this day, in a temple at Syracuse, is shown a shield said to have been Nicias's, curiously wrought and embroidered with gold and purple intermixed. Most of the Athenians perished in the quarries by diseases and ill diet, being allowed only 1 pint of barley every day, and 1/2 pint of water. Many of them, however, were carried off by stealth from the first, were supposed to be servants, and were sold as slaves. These latter were branded on their foreheads with the figure of a horse. There were, however, Athenians who, in addition to slavery, had to endure even this. Now, there should be kindness and fairness to the slaves, even if you do have to capture slaves, but their discreet and orderly conduct was an advantage to them. They were either soon set free or won the respect of their masters, with whom they continued to live. Several were saved by their masters, with whom they continued to live. Several were saved for the sake of Euripides, whose poetry, it appears, was in request among the Sicilians more than among any of the settlers out of Greece, and when any travelers arrived, they could tell them some passage or give them any specimen of his verses. They were delighted to be able to communicate them to one another. Many of the captives who got safe back to Athens are said, after they reached home, to have gone and made their acknowledgments to Euripides, relating how that some of them had been released from their slavery by teaching what they could remember of his poems, and others, when straggling after the fight, been relieved with meat and drink for repeating some of his lyrics. Nor need this be any wonder, for it is told that a ship of Caunus, fleeing into one of their harbors for protection, pursued by pirates, was not received, but forced back, till one asked if they knew any of Euripides' verses, and on their saying they did, they were admitted and their ship brought into harbor. It is said that the Athenians would not believe their loss, in a great degree, because of the person who first brought them news of it. For a certain stranger, it seems, coming to Piraeus, and there sitting in a barber's shop, began to talk of what had happened, as if the Athenians already knew all that had passed, which the barber, hearing before he acquainted anybody else, ran as fast as he could up into the city, addressed himself to the archons, and presently spread it about in the public place, on which there being everywhere, as may be imagined, terror and consternation, the archons summoned a general assembly, and there brought in the man and questioned him how he came to know, and he, giving no satisfactory account, was taken for a spreader of false intelligence and a disturber of the city, and was therefore fastened to the wheel and racked a long time, till other messengers arrived that related the whole disaster particularly. So hardly was Nicias believed to have suffered the calamity which he had often predicted. And also, one of the things about prisoners, captives, whatever you want to call them, it can make a person, it can make a person a target to bewail and depression and stuff like this. But it's actually the duty of the slave masters or guards or whatever you want to call them to prevent the suicides and self-harm.